You are not reading this the way you think you are. Right now, in this moment, as your eyes move across these words, your brain is doing something it does thousands of times every single day. Something so automatic, so invisible, so deeply embedded in the machinery of how your mind operates that you have never once consciously noticed it happening. It is leaving, not dramatically, not with any announcement, not in a way that registers as absence until long after the absence has already occurred. Just slipping. For fractions of a second at first, then full seconds, then longer stretches of time that you will never be able to account for, away from what is directly in front of it and towards something else entirely. A thought that arrived without invitation. A feeling that has been waiting at the edges of awareness for an opening. A memory triggered by a word you just processed. A worry that has been circling the perimeter of your attention since you woke up this morning and is now, in the brief gap created by the act of reading, sliding quietly toward the center. By the time you reach the end of this paragraph, your mind will have left this page at least once, possibly more than once. You will not have noticed it happen. You never do. That is precisely what makes it so significant. This is not a personal failure. It is not a character flaw or a generational weakness or a symptom of a culture that has lost the ability to pay attention. This is what human attention actually does, what is always done, what was built to do by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and what it cannot stop doing regardless of how much we want it to, regardless of how much is at stake, regardless of how important the thing in front of us actually is. And when scientists decided to study this, when they built the experiments, designed the methodology, gathered the data from thousands of real people living real lives across dozens of countries, what came back was disturbing enough that some of the researchers sat with it for a considerable time before they felt ready to state it plainly. The average human mind spends nearly half of its waking hours somewhere other than where it actually is. Not occasionally. Not in predictable dead zones of boring meetings and long commutes and tasks that require no real engagement. In the middle of conversations with people who matter, during meals shared with family, while looking directly into the eyes of someone who is speaking, who deserves to be heard, who has no idea that the mind behind the eyes looking back at them is already somewhere else entirely, during work that the person cares about, during experiences they chose, during the hours of the life they are supposedly living, nearly half of all of it, gone, without awareness, without permission, without any reliable internal mechanism that alerts the person that is happening or brings them back when it does. But here is the part that lifts this beyond an interesting finding in cognitive psychology. Here is the part that makes the story reach into something more fundamental than attention science. The researchers kept going. They kept measuring. They asked not just where the mind was going, but what happened to the people whose minds wandered the most. And the answer to that question connects in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become impossible to dismiss once you see them, to almost everything that determines whether a human life feels like it is working or feels, despite every external indicator of success and comfort, like something essential is perpetually missing. To understand what the scientists found, you need to understand how they found it, because the methodology is as remarkable as the results, and it changed what was possible to know about the human mind in ways that the field had not anticipated. For most of the history of psychology, the wandering mind was nearly impossible to study with any precision. The problem was access. What the mind is doing at any given moment is private, invisible from the outside, and deeply unreliable when self-reported after the fact. The standard approach, asking people to reflect on their mental states during or after a task, produced data that was contaminated by the act of reflection itself. By the time someone reported that their mind had wandered, the wandering was already over, the memory of it already reconstructed, already shaped by what the person believed about themselves and their attention rather than what had actually occurred. What researchers needed was a way to catch the mind in the act, to sample the content of attention in real time without warning, at random moments distributed across the ordinary flow of an actual day. The solution was simple enough to be elegant. Two researchers at Harvard built a smartphone application. The application sent signals to participants at random intervals throughout their waking hours, intervals unpredictable enough that no one could anticipate them and prepare a more flattering answer. Each time the signal arrived, the application asked three things. What are you doing right now? Is your mind on what you're doing, or is it somewhere else? And Regardless of where the mind is, how are you feeling? The study tracked over 2,500 people. It reached participants across 83 countries. It collected data across over 250 different activities. It gathered, in total, more than 89,000 data points, each one a snapshot of a real person's mind at a random moment in a real day. Not a laboratory simulation of attention, not a controlled task designed to reveal cognitive capacity. Real attention in real life, doing what it actually does rather than what it does when it knows it is being observed. The result that defined the study, the finding that went into headlines and textbooks and into the ongoing conversation about what human attention actually looks like when measured honestly, was that the mind was off task 46.9% of the time, almost half, across all activities, across all demographics, across cultures and countries and income levels and ages. The mind that was supposed to be present was, at nearly any given random moment, somewhere else. But that was not the finding that made researchers pause. The finding that made them pause was what happened next, when they looked at the relationship between mind wandering and the happiness scores collected at the same moments. When they asked not just how often the mind wandered, but what it cost the people whose minds wandered most. People whose minds were wandering reported being less happy than people whose minds were on task. Not marginally less happy. Significantly less happy. Consistently, across the full dataset, across every variable the researchers tested and controlled for, a wandering mind was a measurably less happy mind. And the detail that sharpens this into something genuinely difficult to sit with comfortably is this. It did not matter where the mind was wandering. When the researchers broke down the mind-wandering data by content, by whether the thoughts the wandering mind had gone to were pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant, they expected to find that the destination made a difference. That minds drifting toward warm memories or pleasant anticipations would show different emotional outcomes than minds spiraling into worry or regret. They did not find this. Minds wandering toward neutral thoughts were less happy than minds that were present. Minds wandering toward explicitly pleasant thoughts, toward the things people most enjoy imagining, toward the futures they most look forward to, toward the memories they return to most warmly, were still less happy than minds that were present in whatever they were actually doing. Only minds wandering toward unpleasant content showed a larger unhappiness penalty than neutral mind wandering. But even the pleasant daydream, even the warm memory, even the anticipated joy, none of it matched the happiness produced by simply being where you actually were. The researchers named their paper with a line that has since become one of the most cited conclusions in modern attention science. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind, not because of where it wanders, because of the wandering itself, because of the fundamental cost of being somewhere other than where you are, a cost that persists regardless of how pleasant the somewhere else happens to be, regardless of how appealing the alternative the mind has constructed, regardless of what is waiting on the other side of the present moment that the mind has chosen to leave. Before moving forward, the resistance that most people feel when they first encounter this finding deserves to be taken seriously, because it is not a naive resistance. It has a legitimate point. Mind wandering does not usually feel like a problem. It feels like thought. It feels like the interior life that makes a person more than a stimulus response machine. When the mind drifts during a long walk and returns with a solution to a problem that has been sitting unresolved for days, when the shower produces an insight that the desk could not, that does not feel like a failure of attention. It feels like the mind working exactly as it should. And this intuition is not entirely wrong. The human capacity for what psychologists call mental time travel, the ability to project consciousness into the past and future, to simulate scenarios that have not occurred, to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously and compare them, is one of the most extraordinary things about human cognition. Without it, there is no planning, no creativity, no empathy, no moral reasoning, no capacity to learn from what has already happened or prepare for what might happen next. The wandering mind is not only a liability. In the right conditions, it is one of the most powerful tools the brain possesses. But the research draws a distinction that the intuition tends to blur. There is a difference between the mind that wanders with intention, that leaves the present deliberately, moves towards something specific and valuable, and returns with something that could not have been found by staying, and a mind that wanders compulsively, that drifts not because something productive is waiting elsewhere, but because the act of staying present has become, across years of training in a particular direction, genuinely difficult. That leaves not by choice but by habit. That returns not enriched but simply to leave again moments later when the next gap in the current experience presents itself. And what the research consistently finds is that the vast majority of the mind wandering that people actually do falls into the second category: unintentional, unrewarding. The mind leaving not because it has somewhere important to go, but because it has become uncomfortable remaining where it is. Because presence, for most people in the modern world, has quietly become one of the hardest things to sustain. And it is becoming harder. Measurably, demonstrably, year by year, harder. The human attention system was not designed for the environment it currently inhabits. This observation has been made before in various forms by various researchers. But the full weight of it tend to be underestimated because the mismatch is so familiar that it no longer registers as strange. We have adapted behaviorally to an attentional environment that our cognitive architecture was never built to handle, and the adaptation looks, from the inside, like normal life. Human attention evolved across hundreds of thousands of years in conditions of intermittent stimulation, a world where most moments were relatively quiet, where the demands on attention were specific and bounded. A predator in the grass, a change in the weather, a sound from an unfamiliar direction, and followed by long stretches of calm that allowed the attention system to reset, to consolidate, to restore the capacity it had expended. The attention system produced by that environment is extraordinarily good at certain things, at detecting sudden change, at orienting toward novel stimuli with speed and precision, at maintaining vigilance across extended periods when the threat environment demands it. These are remarkable capacities, and they serve our ancestors extraordinarily well across the environments in which they developed. What the attention system was not built for is a continuous, unending, never-pausing stream of novel stimulation with no natural stopping point, no period of genuine quiet, no signal that any given piece of incoming information is more or less important than any other piece, and no off switch, which is a reasonable description of the information environment that most adults in the connected world now inhabit for the majority of every waking day. The smartphone alone, just this one device, this one element of the current attentional landscape, delivers, on average, somewhere between 60 and 80 notifications per day to the people who carry it. Each notification is a small, deliberate interruption, a carefully engineered signal designed by teams of people whose professional success depends entirely on their ability to pull attention away from whatever it is currently doing and redirect it, however briefly, towards something else. These are not accidental interruptions. They are the product of significant investment and sophisticated understanding of how the human attention system works and what it responds to. The people building these systems understand the attention economy better than most attention researchers, because understanding it for them is not academic, it is commercial, and they have been extraordinarily effective. But the cost of each interruption is far larger than the interruption itself. Research on cognitive switching costs, on what actually happens to the mind when attention is pulled from one thing and directed to another, consistently shows that returning to a complex task after an interruption takes, on average, more than 20 minutes, not 20 seconds. 20 minutes of reconstruction, of rebuilding the mental context that was dissolved by the interruption, of reassembling the threads of thought that were dropped, of recovering the state of concentration that allowed the work to be happening in the first place. This means that 3 significant interruptions in a morning, 3 notification-driven switches of attention, can cost a cognitive equivalent of an hour of focused work. Not because the notifications themselves consumed that time, because the reconstruction costs of returning, multiplied across the day, compounds in ways that most people never attribute to the right cause. Most people receive far more than 3 significant interruptions in a morning. But the external interruptions, real and costly as they are, tell only part of the story. Because even in conditions of minimal external distraction, even when the phone has been removed from the room, and the notification silenced, and the environment made as quiet as it can reasonably be made, the modern mind wanders with a frequency and a restlessness that suggests the problem is not only external, it is internal, structural, the result of a long training in a particular direction that has changed not just behavior, but the baseline condition of the attention system itself. Research conducted in controlled laboratory settings, environments where external distractions are deliberately and systematically minimized, finds that the mind begins to wander from a given task within seconds of beginning it, not minutes. Seconds. Before the task is properly started, some part of the brain is already looking elsewhere, already scanning for something more immediately stimulating, more emotionally engaging, more rapidly rewarding than whatever is currently being attempted. This is the attention economy's deepest and least discussed impact. Not that it interrupts us with notifications from the outside, but that it has, across years of chronic exposure to a particular quality and frequency of stimulation, quietly recalibrated the internal threshold below which the mind registers insufficiency and begins reaching for something else. That threshold, the level of stimulation below which the brain signals that what is happening is not enough, that something more interesting must be available, that the mind should be somewhere other than here, has moved, significantly, in the direction of demanding more than ordinary life can reliably provide. A conversation with a person whose company you genuinely value, a meal prepared with care and eaten in real company, a walk through a landscape that contains genuine beauty, a piece of work that requires real skill and produces real satisfaction when done well. An evening at home with people who matter, doing nothing in particular. None of these experiences are producing the level of stimulation that years of chronic overstimulation have conditioned the brain to expect. And so the mind, following the only directive it knows how to follow, finds something that meets the threshold, leaves, not because these experiences are genuinely insufficient, but because the measure of sufficiency has been quietly moved to a place that ordinary life was never meant to reach. Now bring this back to the Harvard data, to the 89,000 moments, to the 46.9%, to the finding that a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. Because the full weight of what that means only becomes clear when you consider not the statistic, but the specific content of what it is describing. The moments that people report at the end of their lives as the ones that mattered most, the experiences that carry the most warmth and the most grief at their passing, are overwhelmingly not the peak experiences, not the milestones and the achievements and extraordinary events marked on the calendar and anticipated for months and photographed and preserved. They're the ordinary ones. A meal with people who were still alive and present and in the room. A conversation that went somewhere unexpected and real. An evening that had no particular agenda and produced no particular product, but felt, in retrospect, like the fullest use of time that time can be put to. An ordinary morning in a particular place with a particular person, doing nothing that would appear in anyone's highlights. That turns out to be the thing the mind returns to with the most completeness and the most ache when it is gone. These are the moments the wandering mind is most reliably absent from. These are the exact experiences, unspectacular, unphotographable, unremarkable to anyone who is not inside them, that require, more than any other kind of experience, the simple and increasingly rare capacity to actually be where you are. And the data says the mind is not there. Half the time, across all moments, it is not there, which means that the ordinary moments, the ones that turn out to matter most, are being half-lived, every day, across years, across the full span of a life, without awareness, without any sense that something is being lost until, sometimes, it is too late to go back and inhabit what was missed. There's a concept in attention research called attentional residue, the phenomenon in which, after switching attention from one task to another, part of the mind remains occupied with the task that was left, unable to fully release it, still processing in the background, still holding unresolved threads of it, even as the conscious attention has nominally moved on to something else. This is why putting the phone down does not immediately free you from what was on the phone. Why a difficult work conversation at 3 p.m. makes it harder to be present at dinner at 7. Why the awareness of an unfinished task occupies a portion of cognitive capacity that is then unavailable for whatever is actually happening in front of you. Not because you're thinking about the unfinished task consciously, but because part of the mind is holding it, running in the background, keeping a thread attached to it that was never properly released. In a life of chronic task switching, which is increasingly the default mode of modern cognitive life. Attentional residue accumulates. What was meant to be temporary becomes the baseline. The background noise of unresolved tasks, impending obligations, and unprocessed interactions rises to a level where it is always present, always consuming some portion of the attention that was supposed to be available for now. And the research on what chronic task switching does to the capacity for sustained focus is unambiguous and sobering. People who habitually divide their attention, who operate in a mode of perpetual partial engagement with multiple streams of information simultaneously, show measurably impaired ability to focus even in conditions where focused attention is what is being attempted and nothing is actively competing for it. The habit of divided attention degrades a capacity for focused attention, not temporarily. Structurally, the mind that is trained across years to split becomes demonstrably worse at unifying, worse at the sustained, single-pointed engagement that the most meaningful work and the most meaningful experience both require. The attention is being changed by how it is used. And the change, the research consistently suggests, is not moving in the direction of greater capacity. What does any of this mean for an actual person, living an actual life, in a world that shows no signs of becoming less stimulating or less interruptive simply because the data recommends it? The answer that the research points toward is not the one that most productivity culture offers. It is not about apps that block other apps, or morning routines designed to protect a sacred hour, or the disciplined elimination of distraction through the sustained application of willpower, because willpower is the wrong tool for a structural problem. And the research on willpower as a mechanism for resisting the pull of a sophisticated, professionally engineered attentional environment is not encouraging. The environment is better at capturing attention than individual humans are at defending it. That is not a personal failure. It is a design outcome. What the research does point toward is something more fundamental and more difficult. A change not in technique, but in orientation. A different relationship between the mind and the present moment. One that is developed not through the heroic suppression of distraction, but through something slower and more patient, through the repeated practice of returning. Through the cultivation, over time, of genuine interest in the experience that is actually happening rather than the experience the mind prefers to construct. The people who show the lowest rates of mind wandering in research studies are not people who have become better at resisting distraction. They are people who have developed, through long and imperfect practice, a different relationship with being where they are, who have discovered, through the specific practice of returning attention to the present moment again and again, and again without judgment, that the present moment, actually inhabited, actually engaged, not used as a launching point for somewhere more interesting, contains more than the wandering mind has ever found anywhere else. This is not a productivity strategy. It is not a technique for getting more done. It is a reorientation toward the basic question of what a life is for and where it is actually lived. And the research suggests it changes not just attention but happiness, relationship quality, work satisfaction, and the fundamental daily experience of being a person moving through the world. Not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably, persistently, in the direction of a life that feels, moment by moment, more fully occupied. Here is where this ends. The study began with a question simple enough to ask 89,000 times to thousands of people living ordinary lives across 83 countries. Where's your mind right now? And the answer, gathered across all that data, averaged across all those moments, distilled into the finding that defined the research, was that nearly half the time, the honest answer was somewhere else, somewhere in a past that has already happened and cannot be changed by the attention directed at it now. Somewhere in a future that may never arrive in the form being imagined. Somewhere in a conversation that ended hours ago and is being replayed with slight modifications that will also make no difference to what actually occurred. Somewhere in a problem that has not yet become real. Somewhere in a gap between what is and what was supposed to be, a gap that the wandering mind visits constantly and never manages to close, because the gap is not in the world. It is in the attention being directed away from a world. And here, the place where the body is, the only moment that is actually available, the only point in time at which anything real can be done or felt or received or given, is, nearly half the time, empty, not because nothing worth attending to is happening here, because the mind has been trained, across years of particular kind of use, to find here insufficient, to treat now as a waiting room for somewhere more interesting, to experience the present moment not as the place where life is occurring, but as the place where life is being deferred until the right conditions arrive. The conditions do not arrive. They are already here. They have always been here. They are here right now, in this moment. In whatever room you are sitting in and whatever is happening around you and whoever is or is not with you, the question the research leaves you with is not a complicated one. It does not require a new system or a different schedule or a better set of habits. It requires only this: to be here, not perfectly, not without the mind ever leaving again, because it will leave again. It will always leave again. That is what minds do, and resisting it is not the point, but to notice when it is gone and to return, without drama and without judgment and without the expectation that the returning will ever become effortless. Just here, more than before, more often, more completely, in the ordinary moments that are, in the end, what life is actually made of. They are happening right now. This is one of them. If this changed something in how you are thinking about your own attention, if it made you notice, even briefly, whether you are actually here right now, this channel is exactly where that kind of thinking lies. We go after questions that reach into the actual experience of being alive and refuse to let go until they give something up. Subscribe if you are not already here. It is free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means you will not miss what we make next. And leave us a comment before you go. We want to know, when did you last catch your mind genuinely somewhere else in a moment that deserved your presence? What pulled it back? Tell us below. We read every single one. And something about this particular question tells us the answers in this comment section are going to be worth staying for.